Hi guys, welcome back aboard the floating frickin' freezer that is Athena for yet another fun DIY sailboat refit video. This video is part 2 in the Proheat X30 hydronic diesel heater series. In part 1 I figured out the location of the buffer tank, the expansion tank. I also got a few of the fan heaters mounted, and I ran most of the PEX tube. Now if you want to see a quick overview of the system I'm putting together, that is in part 1 of this little series. I started out this week by getting the technical compartment primed and painted. This weekend I should be able to put up sound insulation on the inside of the hull, install the expansion tank, the buffer tank, the manifolds, and of course the heater itself. But right now the paint in here is still a little bit tacky, so I'm gonna steer clear for today. Like I mentioned in part 1, the Proheat X30 is at the heart of the system, and there are a few reasons why I'm excited about this little guy. The X30 has a variable heat output ranging from 3.5 kilowatts all the way up to 9 kilowatts. That is the equivalent of 15,000 to 31,000 BTU. The temperature here inside of the boat is going to be controlled by these little CAN bus enabled thermostats. I believe you can have up to 5 individually controlled zones. We won't need that many aboard Athena, but it's a pretty cool feature. This is the PFC, or the Proheat Function Controller. This will allow you to set the mode of the heater. It'll also allow you to set 5 timed events per day, and apparently you can also use this as a diagnostics tool. The X30 also has built-in O2 and gas exhaust temperature sensors to correct the air-to-fuel ratio, making sure that the heater burns as efficiently as it possibly can. Of course, I haven't had this thing fired up yet, so let's not get too excited, but at least on paper, this thing looks pretty spiffy. It's tiny, it's relatively lightweight, and it's got some cool features. So I am very excited to get this fired up. Like I mentioned in part 1 of this series, the Proheat X30 and the marine installation kit have been provided to me free of charge by the manufacturer. The tanks, the fan heaters, the plumbing, all of that stuff, that I've purchased with my own money. Speaking of the fan heaters, the second of the large model of fan heaters arrived yesterday, and that is awesome because that allows me to answer one of the most common questions on last week's video. As you can see on the back of this fan heater, there are some fans, oddly enough. Those are there to push air through this heat exchanger, and of course they need some kind of airflow to be able to do that. There were a lot of people wondering how this thing is going to be able to push air out when it's essentially mounted in a closed-off box. But as you might be able to see here, the grill on this thing is oversized a little bit. So here and here, it's open. There's nothing in the instructions that mention that the fan should require any kind of additional airflow, but once the system is up and running, we can certainly play around with it a little bit and see if it makes any kind of a difference to provide better airflow. But yeah, I think it's gonna be perfectly fine. I've still got the paper template I used for cutting out the hole for the other large fan heater last week. So I'm gonna go ahead and mount this in the forward cabin. I won't bore you guys with that because you've already seen me install the first one. It's the next day and the friendly DHL delivery guy just dropped off the soundproofing for the technical compartment. Oh, so shiny. The main reason I want to add that sound insulation to the technical compartment is because of the generator, not so much the heater. It'll also take care of any condensation issues on the inside of the hull, but yeah, primarily just because of the generator. Although my contact at Dometic has warned me that the X30 can be just a little bit noisy. He's also suggested some things I can do to combat that, like for instance building a little soundproofed box around the heater and snorkeling the air intake. But people's definitions of what's noisy do vary quite a bit, so before I start building any kind of box around the heater, I want to get it fired up and see what it sounds like to me. This soundproofing is the same that I used in the engine compartment, and rather than just relying on the adhesive that's on here, I'm also going to be mechanically securing it using these little plastic doohickeys. These plastic doohickeys are secured with screws, and of course I can't just screw into the hull, so I'm going to epoxy some little pieces of either foam core or wood to the hull that I can then screw these into. I'm just going to secure those little blocks with some thickened epoxy. I think the first piece of soundproofing is going to be the most difficult to fit because there's a bunch of things I need to cut holes for. So as I often do, I've decided to make myself a little paper template. I'm not shooting for perfection here, but it would be nice if this looked good. So somewhere in between perfection and hideous is what I'm aiming for. I'll call that a successful test fit of the first piece. Only another 3 or 4 more to go. The only thing that makes this stuff a little bit difficult to work with is this vibration dampening layer here towards the back of the foam. It's super hard, and I found the best thing is just to cut the foam with a Stanley knife and then use scissors to cut the hard layer. And that's all the pieces in place. The area down here is a little bit special. We'll get back to that later. All that's left to do now is just to mark the location where I want to use those plastic doohickeys to make sure these don't fall down. Sometimes things don't work out the way I've planned, and now would be an example of that. I've spent the last couple of hours trying to figure out a way of making nice uniform holes in this stuff without tearing this shiny film to smithereens. And, well, I've been unsuccessful. So for now, I'm just gonna have to rely on solely the adhesive bond. If the panels start peeling off the side of the hull in the future, well, then we'll deal with it then. With the technical compartment painted and the sound insulation in place, it is finally time to start putting the system together. At the very bottom of the technical compartment, I've built myself a little throne for the buffer tank. The bottom of said throne is insulated with a bunch of Armaflex. My plan is to build a little insulated box around the buffer tank, but I'll hold off on doing that until I know everything is up and running. The next thing I want to install is the manifold. For each one of these red ones up here is going to be a PEX tube that's connected to 1 or 2 fan heaters. Down here is the return from those fan heaters. Over here is the summer valve that will allow us to use the system for just heating water during the summer without heating the boat. Now for all of these metal to metal connections, I'm using Loctite 577. There are plenty of other options for sealing these threads, but I had this 577 left over from the diesel tank, and it should be perfectly fine to use for this too. So far, so good. This connection here between the hot and the cold manifolds is just a loop. I'm sure there is a neater way of doing that. I just really couldn't find any. As you can see, there's 4 connections on each manifold. And if you recall from last week, I only need 3. That's because the 4th one is for a future expansion. That little bit of future proofing might actually already be spoken for, because a while back, Ava noticed that Ran Sailing have a little heat vent outlet thingy in their cockpit, which she thought was a really cool idea. So yeah, we're probably going to end up stealing that idea. After having trimmed the PEX tubes to length and smushed them into the manifolds, I think we're finally ready to install the spiffy looking expansion tank. There's only one connection to the expansion tank. There's not going to be any kind of flow going through the tank, so I'm not going to bother insulating this little guy. Things are starting to look distinctively spiffy in the aft end of the technical compartment. I think the next step is to get the heater mounted. I've already made this little bracket for bolting the X30 to the bulkhead. In response to last week's video, I noticed some comments saying that maybe I should put a rubber mount on the back of this to dampen the vibrations. I don't think it's going to be much of an issue, but if it is, then that's something I could add in the future. In a rare instance of thinking ahead, I realized that I should probably get this mounted on the X30 before mounting the X30 to the bracket, because I can't get to this afterwards, I don't think. This was included with the marine heater exhaust kit, and there's also a little manual that explains everything nice and thoroughly. So apparently I'm supposed to use this style of clamp here. There are some different ones supplied, and I'm also supposed to use some of this stuff, furnace cement. I've never used or even seen this stuff before, but I've noticed this little warning label, so let's be a little bit careful. Fortunately, this little guy does come with instructions on the back. Use wire brush to clean surface, remove paint, apply furnace cement, dampen area before, a thin bead of cement. Okay. That seems pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, I am out of disposable gloves, so I'm gonna have to apply this with a stir stick. I think I might have been able to get to this with the heater installed, but well, this certainly is easier. I see a little bit of squeeze out there. That's very reassuring. So yeah, I think this is okay. I've put the lid back on this little area here just to have somewhere to place the camera while I'm installing the heater. But yeah, I think that looks pretty spiffy. This is going to be a little bit awkward because while the X30 is not heavy, this is kind of an awkward position. Whew. Well, I've got 2 of the bolts in now. That should make life a little bit easier. That was quite the struggle, but the X30 is now mounted. After copious amounts of hose wrangling, it's now a couple of hours later, the plumbing is done, assuming we don't count the exhaust as plumbing. Tomorrow I can start digging into all of the cables, the controller, the thermostat, stuff like that. But there's one more thing I'd like to finish tonight, and that is the connection to the diesel tank. The marine installation kit comes with this somewhat odd looking fuel hose. I've never seen anything like this before. The small hose is all that's needed to actually get diesel to the X30, but I've noticed that this is a marine grade fuel hose, so I'm guessing the reason for the thicker hose is because of some kind of compliance. If we take a quick peek at the fittings that were attached to the heater for the fuel line, you can see that those are different than the ones that were included with the marine installation kit. This little guy is going to screw into the pickup tube on the diesel tank. I placed that a few months back. I believe the way this is going to go together is that this slides over the thinner tube, and this little guy goes on here, and then this guy. According to the instructions, I'm supposed to do this up hand tight and then add 2.5 turns. 1, 2.5. Then I can slide the thicker hose over the hose barb, and there's a little clamp. This feels like a very sturdy solution. I've already attached the pickup tube that was included with the marine installation kit to the diesel tank. That's the little thing poking up there, and there's also a little ball valve included with that. I just gotta get the hose onto there, which is gonna be a little bit fiddly because there's not a lot of room in here. Of course, if I hadn't cluttered up the aft cabin with a ton of stuff, I could have done this from over there, which would have been a lot easier. As you might be able to see down there, we should now have diesel connected to the X30. It is a cold December Sunday morning, and it's time for the scariest part of this entire process, and that is the exhaust. According to the manual, a rigid exhaust is preferable to a flexible one. The marine installation kit comes with the flexible variety, but I can certainly see how the flexible version is a lot easier to work with aboard a boat where everything is kind of cramped and at weird angles. As you saw, yesterday I installed the little condensation loop on the X30 before installing the heater. From there we transition into the flexible hose that goes up way higher than the exhaust through hull. I believe that is to keep water out of the system. And then to connect the flexible hose to the exhaust through hull, there's this small piece of stainless steel tube. Note these measurements here. It is recommended to place the exhaust through hull a minimum of 36 inches above the waterline and have the loop extend a minimum of 12 inches above that. I'm not entirely sure I'll be able to get the full 36 plus 12 inches, but we'll see. The marine installation kit comes with this little pouch of stainless steel goodies. This should be everything I need for the exhaust. The reason I consider the exhaust installation the scariest part of this process is because it involves drilling a somewhat sizable hole in the hull. There are 2 different types of clamps included with this kit. There is an A type and a B type. And the B, there's only one of those, is supposed to be used between the stainless steel tube and the exhaust through hull. I might as well go ahead and install this little tube in the exhaust through hull before I crawl into the cockpit locker. It's going to be a lot easier to do here than in there. I've got some furnace cement on here, so let's just pop this guy in. Last week I asked for suggestions as to where I should install the exhaust through hull. I mentioned this area as a possibility, and then of course the transom. There were a lot of good pros and cons mentioned for each of them. I have decided to go with somewhere on the transom. To get as close as I possibly can to the 3612 measurements mentioned in the instructions, the thru-hull needs to be installed somewhere right around this level. So now I just got to figure out where on this line to place the exhaust thru-hull. I can't put it in the middle of the transom because the wind vane is going to go there, and I don't really want to put it over here because I'm going to have to build some kind of enclosure around the exhaust so that we can still use the cockpit locker. And if I build it here, then I'm going to lose a lot of space in the cockpit locker. So somewhere over here is probably my best bet. After copious amounts of head scratching, I think this right here is probably going to be my best bet. The exhaust comes out from the X30 there, loops up, comes back down again, and then the exhaust thru-hull is going to be somewhere in there. That should maximize the amount of space we have available here in the cockpit locker. And yeah, I think that's my best bet. The instructions tells you to maintain at least a 2-inch clearance between the exhaust system components and any combustible material. I'm assuming that includes the hull. With the location I've got in mind, maintaining those 2 inches should be pretty easy. We are somewhat close to the chain plate for the backstay, but I don't think that's going to be an issue from a structural standpoint. So yeah, let's go ahead and drill a giant hole. I think this is going to look pretty dang spiffy. Welcome back into the cockpit locker. Now, as you can see, I've put a little bit of yellow tape over the hole because I'm not going to be able to finish the exhaust today. To maintain proper clearance from the exhaust tube here from the hull, I'm going to be epoxying a little bit of wood onto the hull, and then I'll use these spacers to make sure that the exhaust stays away from the hull. But it is too cold today to use epoxy. I was kind of hoping that I could finish the heater installation today, but it is going to take quite a bit of time to add coolant to the system, get everything aired out. I'm also going to have to run the wiring to the heater. That's going to be a little bit of a challenge. And of course, finishing the exhaust. I've got a good feeling about getting the heater started up next week. And that would also mean I would have heat here aboard Athena before Christmas, and not freezing my behind off is certainly a nice little Christmas present. I feel really good about the scary part of drilling the big hole in the transom being done, so next week it should be pretty smooth sailing. And yeah, that's going to be the end of this week's video. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like. See you!